Today we've got Jesse Barnard again. We're talking about training resuming and the probability that a lot of us will just jump straight back in, and our bodies have had quite a bit of a break and won't be used to it, and there could be some issues arising with injuries that won't be welcome at the time. So Jesse's got some thoughts and ideas and advice on a few things we can consider on that re-entry into training in a few weeks' time. So I'm going to hand time over to Jesse, ask him a few questions, and he'll provide the answers. Hopefully.
I'll do the disclaimer first. That's right.
Yeah, disclaimer.
Yeah, so I'm a personal trainer with a few extra certifications, but I'm not a medical practitioner, so bear that in mind with everything I'm saying. I'll try and use references where I can, but all of this should be taken with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Probably the first obvious question is, what will be the best way to transition back into the Jiu-Jitsu specific training that we do, to reduce the possibilities of injuries and problems there?
Yeah, so most physiotherapists and medical practitioners will tell you that load management is the biggest factor going back into a sport after a long hiatus. So if we consider over time that we've taken a step back from training, so naturally our muscles and our connective tissue is all what used to be adapted to hard training has all taken a bit of a step back. So as we transition back into training, we need to make sure that we're going back at a slower pace and slowly building over time. So what does that look like in the Jiu-Jitsu scenario? It means that we ensure that when we go back to training, we are not going back all guns blazing. It's a very Western philosophy that you have to train hard to get results at 100% of your ability. It's a more Eastern philosophy that you can train sub-maximally and still get good results, and then actually have better longevity and skill development. So I hear these terms a lot, no pain, no gain, and go hard or go home. But the reality is that in a Jiu-Jitsu environment, and especially once you've taken a long break off, that's probably not the wisest way to go about training. Instead, training with an emphasis on skill development will mean that you are less likely to injure yourself. And by skill development, I mean more drilling and less hard rolling. There is a time for hard rolling and hard sparring, but that's probably leading up to a competition, not coming back after a long break. So what this looks like, and I'll give you an example to start with, is you utilise a thing called RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion. So say, for example, you might be able to pick up a 15 kilogram dumbbell and at the very hardest you can possibly going 100% of your max, you can do 10 reps. So if you had to do an 11th rep, you physically couldn't, even if your life depended on it. What it looks like going back is that you'd actually do 5 reps and stop before you hit failure, then come back the next day and you're right to train again without having fatigue of the day before. So if you taper the intensity of your training and bear in mind that more volume is probably a priority over more intensity coming back, it means that you get more sessions in throughout the week, even though they're sub-maximal in intensity. But rather than say going extremely hard on Tuesday class, extremely hard on Thursday class, and then being completely ruined and fatigued for rolling on a Saturday class, you might go 70% of your rate of perceived exertion on Tuesday. Wednesday, go again, 70% of your rate of perceived exertion. Once again, Thursday, going again, 70%, and then you're still right to go on Saturday. And at the end of the week, you are you're better recovered because you haven't absolutely ruined your body, you haven't redlined your vehicle, so to speak. And at the end of the week, you've got more training volume in than the person who went crazy 3 times a week at 100% of their max.
There's a couple of things there, specifically with Jiu-Jitsu, because I can understand that in a sort of weightlifting and working out solo type of situation. Yeah, it's easy to go 70%. But when you have an opponent who is, has as much ego as you, that 70% quickly becomes 100%.
Yeah.
So I guess it's really important to have an agreement between those you're rolling with, if you're rolling, and more so than drilling, to that we're only going to go 70%. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
Probably having the conversation to start with would be the biggest factor. And we know that in the Jiu-Jitsu class, you will probably get tapped, if not by people at your own level, definitely by people that are higher belts than you. And that's the reality of Jiu-Jitsu, and that's how you learn. So if you treat even people that are on your same level or people that are maybe lower belts than you, if you drop the ego completely, you might get tapped by them working sub-maximally, so working at a 70% intensity. But what happens is you learn, you minimise injury for them and yourself, and at the end of the day, you can go, okay, using no strength and not pushing to 100%, these are the technical issues that I was facing, which resulted in me getting tapped by a lower belt, or by a belt that is my level. So, to me, I think it's just more of a accepting that in order to get better in the long run and for the longevity of your body, the ego has to be dropped. Yeah.
And the other thing there too is, particularly at our class, the age range is quite large. Got the younger fit guys against the older fit guys. There is a very big difference there. I think the younger guys with their high level of ego probably think everyone's at one level, so they go hard with everyone. And the older guys also think that they are at that same level. They're far gone past that. So I think the older people and injury is probably a bit more relevant because they will get injured a lot easier. Yeah.
So in class, I think there is definitely a few factors which will contribute to your injury other than load management. One would be your movement mechanics and your posture. So, I can give probably 3 examples of this. If you have, the most popular injuries in Jiu-Jitsu, I think, are lower back injuries, shoulder injuries, and knee injuries. Now,
I've had all those.
Yeah. So, you can tell, even in a class, that people get a bit lax when they're so focused on technique that they start to forget, hold on a minute, when I'm squatting down for a double leg, or when I'm squatting down to pass guard, or where I'm driving forward in a shot, and or even lifting in sort of a Greco-Roman move, they're so focused on technique that they go, okay, hold on, what's my back doing at the moment? And often I have seen, personally, a correlation between people that get lax in that and lower back pain. That's just one example. And I've seen people that have obviously very tight hips, and then because they've got tight hips, their lower back, which should be a stable sort of like trunk of the tree, the further you get up the spine, the more flexion you can sort of tolerate. But the lower back is inherently stable, more stable than the thoracic spine or cervical spine. So that takes a hit when you've got a lack of mobility in the hips. And so when they're squatting down, they're doing the old classic butt wink, where their natural lumbar curve becomes flexed, and then on top of that, if they're trying to lift someone up into a double leg takedown with a flexed back, it's just a mechanism for injury, being a disc bulge, which is exactly what happened to me. So the way to solve issues like that is to address the issue at its root cause. It might be a genetic factor, which you can't really help, but you can sort of minimise. It might be a movement mechanics factor. So you need to assess, okay, I've got lower back pain. Why is that? Well, when I squat, I know that my back is bending, my lumbar spine is bending, and that's when I start to get pain. Why is it bending? Well, I can't sit at the bottom of a squat without flexing my lower back. My hips don't allow me to. So, okay, I need to address my hip mobility. Then on top of that, if you've got a niggling injury, it's important to look upstream and downstream of the injury and also address that. So for example, with a knee injury, if you're getting really, really sore knees, so sore patella or something like that, patella tendon, it might be an acute thing or a chronic thing. So you might have fallen in the wrong way and it hurts, but most of the time it's actually a chronic thing that you keep doing and you're not realising is wrong. So every time you do a drop C Nagi, you drop into your knee and it gets hurt, and you keep doing that every day without addressing the issue. So what you might want to look at is, I'm getting knee pain, what can I do about it now? The answer is that you might be able to do some massage or myofascial release, get on a ball, get on a foam roller, get one of those massage guns, address the issue upstream, being the quads, downstream being the shins, and even behind with the hamstring and the calf. That might be an issue. Number two would be, like I said, with the lumbar spine, a movement mechanics issue. So every time you squat, maybe your knee is tracking too far forward over your foot, which is causing a lot of pressure on your knee joint, when technically in a squat, the power and the drive should be coming from your hips, utilising glutes, which is a stronger muscle and more able to withstand load. And then another factor might be that you're not giving it adequate rest, but most of the time it's the top two. So if you look at if you stop injuries or little niggles before they get to a bad stage, and this is not including an acute injury but more of a chronic injury, then you can minimise them or prevent them or prehab them before they get worse. So it's just about being conscious in training, older or younger, of what your body's doing. Even if it means you drill slower, go, okay, have I got the correct posture here? Am I doing this right? Am I listening to what the coach is saying about where my head's at, my head position, and all the little things, the intricate details that have been refined from you. I mean, you're a black belt, so you've been through it all the way from day dot. So the little things like head position that you've picked up on over time can really help avoid, one, a cervical spine issue in your neck, but also your ability to pull off a move in a lot more efficient and safe way.
Yeah. Okay, so you've listed a few of the more prevalent injuries associated with Jiu-Jitsu. Maybe we look at lower back and how that might look in posture-wise in certain scenarios for Jiu-Jitsu.
Yep.
Would that be worthwhile?
Yeah, we'll do that. So I've had a lower back injury. I'll say I've had a disc bulge, and it was horrific. But I figured out through a bit of trial and error that there is things you can do whilst training Jiu-Jitsu that can drastically help. And there's also things you can do outside of Jiu-Jitsu that can drastically help. But I'll give you an example here while I'm with Professor. So a lot of the time, I see people when they're going into pass guard or going into for a double leg and things like that, they have a tendency to sit and be very, very crouched with a massive lumbar curve in their spine, and it's not the natural curve, which is sort of inwards facing. It's the outwards facing. So they're hunched, and this is causing an issue. This is exacerbated if you're also loaded. So if you're trying to lift someone with a bent back, you're only going to cause injury. But in the case where so if we're here and we're trying to stand up to guard with a closed, with a flexed spine, flexed spine, you're really, really susceptible to injury. So instead of being here, it might be better to find another way out that doesn't involve you trying to muscle through it, or when you're coming in for a guard pass, focus on the fact that you can still maintain a good posture here and utilise your glutes as the primary driving factor in passing guard, whatever way you need to. And you can still keep that posture if you stand up for a double leg. So it might be that you're here and you're shooting. One of the biggest issues is that when people shoot, they're shooting in here and they might get sprawled. One, because they've got a flexed back, but two, because their head's not in the right position. So if you come in with a lot better posture and focus on driving up, you'll see here my back is in a strong, stable position, utilising its natural curves, and then I've got more driving power to be able to lift here. So there's two examples. Training the spine outside of Jiu-Jitsu practice to prevent injury is also another factor. So one of the issues is that it's hard to summarise, but if you train a spine to be hyper flexible, then that's exactly what you're going to get out of it in training. So the example is if you've got a belly dancer who's got a very, very flexible spine, and you put them under a squat rack, naturally they're not going to be able to lift as much as a power lifter who has a very, very stable spine. But if you take that power lifter and take them to a yoga class, then they're naturally not going to be able to flex as much as the belly dancer. So it's about finding the happy medium between the two. For me, I found that I was very, very hyper flexible, which was causing issues with my squat pattern, with my hip hinge pattern, and meaning that my spine would always naturally flex unconsciously. So my hips weren't the main power factor. I was utilising my spine too much. So addressing this outside of class, it would look like training the spine for stability and then training the hips for mobility. What that would then mean is every time you go to pass guard or every time you shoot for a double leg, your glutes are going to be the primary drivers, and you've also got the mobility to sink down, utilising that new range of motion that you've got in your hips, and to be able to stabilise and brace correctly in your core for a better drive and a better lift. So training the spine for stability, I would recommend a fellow by the name of Dr. Stuart McGill. He's a spine biomechanic from the University of Waterloo, and he advocates for exercises that are going to essentially treat your spine and the muscles surrounding your spine like a sort of a pole, and all the muscles around the spine are like cables holding it all together, as opposed to treating the spine like a bicep, for example. You're not meant to flex and extend the spine under load. It's not built for that, and the way we know that is because any good power lifter will tell you that during its squat, the last thing they do is move their spine. That's just the spine has to be stable for them to endure load, and you get out of the spine what you train it for. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's good. I don't know if we do it now, but are there maybe one or two simple exercises we can do to focus on that sort of strength in the back that you could sort of give?
I'll give you the big three. These are my favourite ones. I'm sure I can probably do it on camera. So, as I said before, Dr. Stuart McGill is a spine biomechanic from the University of Waterloo. He's trained Olympic athletes, NBA, NBL players, all of the above, and he has a very, very good success rate in rehabilitating and prehabilitating spine injuries. He advocates for these three exercises. In the US, there was a high rate of disc bulges, largely due to their training methods and utilising a crunch or a sit-up to increase core strength. So what happens if you do that is that you flex your spine and cause a lot of pressure on the discs or the vertebrae doing that. So as in disc going down into the ground. And by doing this, over time, you're actually putting a lot of pressure on your lumbar spine. Instead, he told us to do this one instead. So what we've got here is it's called the McGill curler. You're going to make a diamond with your hands and put it underneath the small of your lower back. One foot is going to go out, the other one stays up. This means that your hip will sit in its natural curve in its natural position in relation to your lumbar spine. So once you're here, you're going to imagine that there is a set of scales between your shoulder blades. You're just going to make the scales go to zero by lifting your thoracic spine off the floor only a little bit. It's not a crunch or a sit-up. You're just going from here, looking up at the ceiling, and then lifting so that you've got tension in your core. Now you're going to hold it. It is quite hard. And then relax. You're going to hold it and brace for about 10 seconds, switch legs, and then go again like so. Now what this means is that it's teaching the front portion of your core to resist and withstand load coming from the front using gravity. The second exercise is a side plank. So this is increasing stability from a lateral position. We all know what a side plank looks like. So from here, you're going to go top leg over the front of the back leg, hop up, and then hold. So what this means, and it's very, very effective in judo and stand-up Greco-Roman wrestling, is that every time that someone collar ties you to one way or tries to pull you one way, your ability to withstand that load from your core is strengthened by a side plank. The last one, and I think the most important one in my opinion, this really, really helped with my disc bulge, is a bird dog. So you're going to be on all fours here. You're going to actively push into the ground. To set yourself into a neutral position, you're going to go cat camel. So here, then here, into full sort of extension. And then from here, you're going to blow out and brace. When you blow out, you naturally brace. So if you can blow out, hold that position, but still continue to breathe, you're going to take your right hand, it's going to go out in front, and your left leg, and it's going to kick back. The important thing to do with this exercise is to keep the core as stable and as tight as you can. This will mean that your glutes become the primary driving factor in kicking your leg back, and it teaches a good movement pattern so that every time you shoot for a double leg, your hip is working independently of your spine. Your glutes are working independently with your spine. So it's the right way to do it looks like this. And then we'll swap hands and legs. The wrong way to do it, and I see this a lot as well, is when you are tilting your spine to try and get your leg up, either way. And this is the issue with any kind of squat or hip hinge. If your spine is moving while you're trying to utilize your glutes, naturally your glutes will lose power. So if you've got a stable spine, then your central nervous system will tell your body, yep, I'm ready to produce high levels of power and energy. If your spine is flimsy, your central nervous system will go, nah, we're not ready, don't release too much power. And that's why you see powerlifters do the big suck in, brace, squeeze the glutes, spread the toes, and then lift. Yep. It's all setting the central nervous system up for load.
Cool, alright. And so you started doing those when you had your back problem. When did you see an improvement after doing those?
So I remember I was in pain for about 10 months, and then within starting these exercises and increasing my hip mobility using the Dr. Stuart McGill method, I was pain-free in 4 to 6 weeks, and I was back at Jiu-Jitsu by 8 to 10 weeks. So very, very effective, especially considering I was in pain for 10 months. I will say something else. So the important thing to think about with most injuries and with your body, but definitely with a lumbar spine injury, is every time you do a good movement with good posture and correct movement mechanics, you're putting money in the bank for your longevity. Every time you do it wrong, you're taking money out, and it just means that your body will conk out eventually. So I started thinking about training a lot differently. Every time I'd get out of bed in the morning, every time I put my shoes on, every time I'd wash myself in the shower, whatever it would be, every time I was at Jiu-Jitsu doing a move, I started to think about what my back is doing and keeping it neutral and strong and stable, and then utilising my primary drivers being my hips.
When you say neutral, what does that mean? Just
so
like a pole?
The way to the spine has three natural curves. You got your cervical curve, your thoracic curve, and your lumbar curve, and then your hips. So the way that we know we're bracing correctly is you can push your fingers, and you can do this with me if you want, push your fingers into your obliques, below your rib cage and above your hip socket, hip girdle. What you can do is breathe in about 70% and then blow out and hold. And you should feel your obliques pop out. This is a brace position. Now if you can learn to breathe but keep that tight with a punch test the whole time, this is how you should be under load.
Okay.
Now when you're not loaded, you can be more relaxed, you can be more flowy and flimsy, but anytime you're loading, you should hit neutral.
Okay.
Really. And I'm talking whether it's lifting or lifting weights or lifting a human, you want to be neutral. It just means that you're less susceptible to injury. Now there's exceptions, there's always exceptions for these rules. I mean, you won't see a powerlifter go to an Atlas stone and be able to hit neutral as they're lifting.
Yes.
But they train to be strong in that flexed position as well, and it's a bit different. But for the layman, anytime you're loaded, you should be neutral, and that same rule can apply to Jiu-Jitsu, and it's especially during the rehab process. So, and this is not a knock on medical practitioners at all, but I went to every medical practitioner under the sun when I had my disc bulge, and everyone told me a different thing.
Don't get me started about medical practitioners.
I mean, the old saying, if all you've got is a hammer, everything is a nail. So if you go to a doctor, they'll prescribe pills, they might refer you to a surgeon. The surgeon will say, surgery is the only answer. The chiropractor will say, maybe cracking your back is the only answer. The physio might say, you need to stretch more or flex more to try and introduce that movement back. And I heard a lot of
specialists, they're focused on a very small part of your body.
Yeah. And there's definitely, don't get me wrong, without medical practitioners, all dead.
I know.
But there's definitely really, really good ones who I've met, and shout out to my physio, Lara Matuzek. But then there's also ones that probably are a bit outdated with their methods. So the one thing I learned throughout my rehab process for lumbar injury, and I still do this to this day, is that while it's inflamed, it makes sense not to pick the scab. So like the old, if you've hit your thumb with a hammer, you don't then come back the next day and go, let's test it today. So when I had my back injury, before I figured out what I was doing, I was going, it still hurts today, I'm going to try, and maybe more barbell squats will help, or maybe if I just focus on doing deadlifts, my back will get stronger and that will reduce my pain, when actually it's doing the opposite effect. If you treat your spine with the respect that it deserves, give it time to heal, keep it neutral, even doing stuff throughout the house, because if you put your shoes on wrong and you're reefing, tying your shoes up, trying to put your shoes on with a flexed lumbar spine, you're just picking the scab, you're taking money out of the bank, and you're going to pay for it later in Jiu-Jitsu class, or when you go to bed that night and you can't sleep because you've got terrible sciatica.
Yeah.
So a quick example of that is if you've got rather than doing your shoes up like this with a terrible flex spine, bring your foot up to a level where you can naturally bring your hips to it and do it up without exacerbating the pain. And that same principle applies across the board to almost all injuries. If you've got knee pain from doing drop C and Argies, put a knee brace on, or put some, one of those, I think it's what are they called? Knee pads. Yeah, knee pad, like a basic one. They work. Or figure out what you're doing wrong. You might be every time you go to pass someone's guard, your knee's like so far over your toe, and it's just putting all this pressure on your patellar tendon. Yeah. So rather than doing that, be here. Still be mindful that they might underhook that leg, but be protective of it as you're passing. Or if you are going to go down and pass guard, make sure that you're not putting too much pressure on that knee as you're doing it. Yeah.
I guess the difficult thing is with Jiu-Jitsu, I guess a lot of martial arts where there's an opponent, is that you're not only trying to focus yourself on doing the right thing, but the other person's trying to stop you doing the right thing. And so particularly with Jiu-Jitsu, it's you're not just standing up, you're lying down a lot too. So it's that transition between the two is probably you got to focus a bit harder on to maintain that neutral position.
You might actually have to change your game a bit. Yeah. I mean, I know when I had my back injury, I refused to get stacked. I was like, I'm not getting stacked, because that was one of the original things that exacerbated my disc bulge. And so I developed every defense there was for a stack. And then if someone did stack me, get past my guard and try to stack me, I'd roll back into a turtle position. I'd rather come back to class the next week or get tapped in this class than get re-injured and be out for 6 to 8 weeks. And that's the whole mentality thing about longevity versus intensity or winning. Yeah.
Alright, so that's backs. I've had some back issues. Knees, I've obviously done my MCL, both MCLs recently. And I think I was noticing you talking about when you're going for a double leg, get your sort of track over your knee over your toe sort of thing. But I think I've always done it. I've shot in and come down and pushed off always pushed off like that.
Yeah.
And that's probably like the caused a lot of issues with my MCLs and like all of this would have been good to know 20 years ago. How can I correct those sort of issues now? Or is it too late?
It's not too late. I think. Well, actually, just back on dishwashing, disc bulges are less likely to give you pain as you get older, because there's less fluid in your discs, so you're naturally more compressed, which means you are less susceptible to bulging out. But with knees, and it's a very popular complaint, is that with chronic problems, it's probably too much of a pressure placed on knees rather than ankles and hips over time. So movement mechanics would be number one, and Dr. Kelly Starrett from America, he's got a book called The Supple Leopard. It's one of my favourite books. He talks about the importance of, one, not letting your knee track too far over you. Sometimes it is, that's just reality. But so utilising the correct movements. Two, creating torsion so that you avoid slack in the joint and you avoid too much movement. So sometimes, especially like meniscus and that, if you've got too much slack, like for example, you're running on concrete and there's too much slack, you're just going to wear away at your meniscus and things like that. So one of the ways to create torsion, and it's the same rule that applies with bending the bar in a bench press to create torsion in your shoulder, you want to externally rotate from your hips, and it will create torsion in your knees, torsion in your ankles, and then when you go down, it means that everything's tight and moving correctly. So what this looks like is that if you're squatting, you'll see a lot of people actually have a valgus fault where they squat knee in, and that's exactly what you're talking about when you're shooting for a double. That's happening, which is causing pressure on here, the connective tissue in your knee, but also your ankle. And there's a good chance you'll probably roll it from there as well. So
ankle problems too.
Yeah, so to create torque, and teaching a basic squat, you address this. So with a basic squat, you spread your toes to create sort of, you grip the floor, then you're going to externally rotate, pretending that there is two plates underneath your feet. You're also going to spread that way like you're ripping a sheet of paper between your legs. It's hard to do it in socks because I'm going to move. But by doing that, spreading toes, externally rotate, creating torsion, and then from here, rather than shifting the knees forward, creating knee pressure, you're shifting hips back as the primary mechanism. From here, you get a good squat, knees are tracking over just fine, and then rather than focusing on lifting up here, creating the, what's the word? The imagery of shooting your hips forward, like there's a rope attached to you, and your aim now is to try and, as hard as you can, shift your hips forward, like pelvic thrust forward, utilizes the glutes as the primary driver. So all these things coming into play at once, it's hard to remember, but if you do it as a habit and you're conscious of it daily, all of a sudden it just becomes second nature. So I don't even think really now about am I squatting correctly in class?
Just naturally.
Because I've been doing it for a long time, and since then I've had zero back pain and I get zero knee pain. The other thing to consider with knees is a lot of it leg exercises. Focus on the what's the word? Focus on one plane, which is forward and back, up and down. With the side plank, if I just do this, you also get the added benefit, as well as training the side of your core here, that you're loading the knee from the side angle. So you're telling your knee that sometimes you're going to get pressure placed on it laterally, and that's okay. My connective tissue is adapting. From here, you can also practice loading laterally with a squat pattern. So sometimes while I'm doing my side plank, I'll actually come down, squat, come out, because once again, gravity is doing its work. I'm loading laterally. It's not too much load that it's going to hurt me, but I'm just developing the ability for my knee on both sides, in and out, to withstand load. So you have to expect that if you don't train for lateral loading, then when you get laterally loaded in training, say someone shoots for a double leg while you're at an angle, that you're susceptible to injury unless you've addressed the issue. Proprioception stuff as well is huge with ankle injuries. We wear shoes all day, so our ability for our sort of fine motor pattern skills to correct, and our toes to correct an offset of balance is probably a bit stuffed, just due to the shoe wearing and things like that. So I'm a massive advocate for running barefoot on grass, but doing exercises sometimes with your eyes closed, so that you're bare feet, to allow all the little intricate muscles in your foot to adapt to load placed on it. Balancing on one foot, doing that kind of thing, can all help in the long run. And it's all little things, but
particularly the older you get, if you stick with Jiu-Jitsu, these are all things you need to consider. I wish I considered a lot earlier, because I've developed chronic issues now that they're harder to fix the older you get and the longer you leave them. So
the other one's shoulder. We can touch on shoulder quickly. So I think the biggest issue with shoulder is that we've developed the bodybuilding mindset. And if you want to be a bodybuilder, that's great, but bodybuilder is about your shoulder looking the biggest it can, and strength training is about being as strong as you can. But if you're thinking about training in terms of Jiu-Jitsu, you need to train for, one, longevity would be the first priority, and then two, strength in large range of sort of movements, because sometimes you're going to have to withstand some load while your arm's stretched out here. Sometimes you're going to land in an awkward position. Your shoulder joint should be able to withstand a lot of different movements, and if you only ever work it in the one plane, which I see a lot of people do, or lateral raises, then they're not really exercising effectively for Jiu-Jitsu. So the one thing is, the shoulder is a very, very mobile joint. I think it's the most mobile joint that we have in our body. And you want to utilize that and make sure it's strong in its every range of motion. The other thing is that it's very important for the shoulder joint to be stable, so the humerus in the shoulder girdle is actually stable. Mm-hmm. It's mobile, but it's stable as well. So if it's not stable, you start to get sort of shear, and you'll have problems with your rotator cuff and things like that. So one of the most effective exercises is what a lot of physios prescribe for shoulder injuries, and that is actually exercising your rotator cuff. So your rotator cuff gives your shoulder the ability to internally and externally rotate, as well as keep it stable. So rather than just working your shoulders in the usual planes that you see in the gym every day, you've got to exercise it laterally. So you might use a banded external rotation, or even...
Okay, so being back at Jiu-Jitsu, I was a bit eager and I sustained an injury, but I still want to keep training. Is it a good idea to keep training, or should I just call it quits for a little while and come back?
Doctor's advice comes first, as always, but I would say that most injuries you can do other things and still sort of practice Jiu-Jitsu whilst also rehabilitating an injury. One thing that most physios are saying now anyway, it used to be the RICE method, rest, ice, compression, elevation, but now physios are saying police method, which is protect, optimally load, ice, compression, elevation. So essentially what it means is that if you can use the joint, say you tweaked your wrist, the last thing you want to do now, according to modern day science, is to, unless it's broken bones or anything like that, is to just hold it in place and just rest it for days. It becomes stiff, becomes weak, and it does the opposite effect of what you want, which is to rehabilitate it and make it come back just as strong as it was before. So now what they're saying is, if you can move the joint, if you can move the injury and use it in any way, then do that. But make sure that you're not doing it and pushing it past the point where you're exacerbating the injury with pain. So there's a difference between good pain and bad pain. Yeah. I feel like naturally, if you've just sustained an injury, you're going to have a bit of pain, and that's fine. But usually, with a little bit of movement, you get the blood flowing. It actually does a whole lot of good to the injury. And then, you'll definitely be able to tell the next, half an hour to an hour, if not the next day, whether you've done bad or good to it. So like, if I sustain an injury, and it's relatively minor, then I'm exercising it to get the blood flowing, to get the rehabilitation process in place. Your body has a natural ability to heal itself, and sometimes you just have to allow it to do that with time. But going back to a class with an injury, I think most of us are pretty good in going, okay, if this person's got an injured elbow, then be mindful of that. And we always, especially with injuries, maybe not if we haven't got injuries, but with injuries, we sort of taper back for their sake. If you've got a wrist injury, just don't use the wrist. I mean, I know it's like easier said than done, but you can start rolling with one hand for a while. Strap it to your belt. I think Tyson had a really bad foot injury for a while, and he was, this was way back before his last one. He sort of strapped up his legs and was just rolling with essentially a mermaid style body. And even me with my back injury, after a while, I ended up coming back and I was just sort of drilling for a long time. That way I can control the load that's placed on my body. So you can still show up to class, you can still do things that are going to at least maintain the skill, maybe not get drastically better all that fast, but you can maintain the skill. And you've always been very accepting of the fact that, even in warm-ups and things like that, when we're doing our monkey drills and stuff, if someone's got an injury, you can do something else, or you can just sit out for that part or whatever. So there is ways around it. You've just got to think outside the box a little bit.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so if you had someone came to you and said, "Oh, Jesse, can you help me out with some, set of a routine or a set of exercises that I can use for my Jiu-Jitsu," what would you recommend?
Cool. So the first thing is you factor in that they're coming to you, so the exercise is a supplement to their Jiu-Jitsu. Therefore, Jiu-Jitsu is their main priority in this case. So the development of their skill is priority. You have to factor that in when looking at an exercise program, say over the period of a week, because if they're going hard on Tuesday at Jiu-Jitsu class, going hard on Wednesday at Jiu-Jitsu class, and then going hard on a Saturday, it's safe to say that they're not going to be able to get under a heavy squat rack on the Friday and do a powerlifting, routine and squat heaps of heavy weight. So if that is your first priority, skill development, then the key things with strength and conditioning is, one, you're doing exercises that are functional for Jiu-Jitsu. So in my opinion, and this is only my opinion, I don't see how a barbell back squat has much carryover for almost anything in Jiu-Jitsu. I've got an opinion on that because I'm quite biased, but if you tell me, you definitely need a squat pattern, that's something that is vital for Jiu-Jitsu. You need a squat pattern, you need a hip hinge pattern, you need a push pattern, a pull pattern. That's the other thing. Stop training your body based on muscle groups and start training it based on movement patterns. That's the way that things are going these days. Yeah. We've sort of, unless you're a bodybuilder, there's almost no point in isolating particular muscles. It doesn't do anything for you in a fight scenario. Makes you bigger, makes your muscles look bigger, but sometimes function is more important than looks. And in the case of Jiu-Jitsu, that is 100% the case. So once you've covered off on the main movement patterns, you've got to select exercises that are effective in getting you stronger, but also that don't detract from your Jiu-Jitsu in any way and actually increase longevity as well. So I would say, rather than, for example, doing a barbell back squat, you're better off getting a heavy sandbag or a heavy punching bag and loading from the front and then squatting up and down with that, or lunging up and down with that, because that, that's more like a human than a barbell sitting on your cervical spine. Yeah. And you're also not going to be working in one lateral plane. So I would suggest that, so look at a double leg takedown. If you did a barbell conventional up and down squat, you might see some gains in your ability to drive coming out of a double leg takedown. But more effectively than that, if you got a sled drag machine, one of those heavy sled drag machines, and then emulate the double leg takedown move, and then push with that move into a heavy sled, that's way more effective in getting power and drive into the double leg and then shooting up and out. Or, that's the first portion. The second portion might be that your ability to lift your opponent up and over. So that's when you get the heavy front-loaded squat using a sandbag or whatever, and then lunge up and down with that, say walking lunge with that. So exercise selection, functionality is key, but then also training volume is the biggest factor. The last thing you want to do is get injured. So if you're working very, very hard with a Jiu-Jitsu class, it's important that you take a step back for a minute and go, how hard am I going to need to train outside of Jiu-Jitsu to supplement my Jiu-Jitsu without increasing my risk of injury? So at the end of the week, you want to make sure that you're getting enough load in that you're going to get some gains, but also you're getting the correct amount of recovery, being sleep and eating correctly, and things like that, so that you're not detracting from your jiu-jitsu as well. What I like to do personally is I would always emphasise someone moving their body correctly first and then introducing load. So if they can't do a push-up, why would you be going and doing a bench press? It makes almost no sense.
Yeah.
You have to be able to move your body on its own before you start introducing load, in my opinion. So what that looks like is, and for me, the way I train is that I break my days up into an upper body day, where I focus on all the movements that are applicable to Jiu-Jitsu in my upper body. It's too much to get them all in on one day. And then second day would be lower body day, where I might look at the squat pattern, hip hinge pattern, and a couple of accessory exercise. And then I have a day where I completely focus on all of my weak points, or things that are don't fall into the category of upper or lower, but are very important and will help me with my longevity. So on my accessories day, I might do some neck bridges, some stable neck bridges. I might do some grip strength stuff. I might do some massage and myofascial release. I'll make sure that my range of motion hasn't taken a hit too much over the week. And if I've got any sore spots, I'll address them. If I'm starting to get a bit lax with my lumbar spine, I've noticed that when I'm doing double legs and I get a bit lazy, I'll look at, okay, are my glutes working? And if not, then I'll go and do some hip thrusts, focusing on activating the glutes and things like that. So it's just about being conscious of what you're training and why, rather than just going through the motions and training like every other person that you see in the gym.
Now, what are your thoughts on, do you train every day?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on training every day, as opposed to, the more common thing is go hard on, say, 3 days a week and rest?
So I'm of the belief, and I think there's a big shift in fitness culture at the moment, where it's like conventional periodization techniques, like say block training or powerlifting programs and things, where they go a portion of or a season of just strength, a season of just hypertrophy, and a season of sort of power, and then a deload or whatever, or in those moments you've got deload as well. Now, there's been a bit of a shift, and especially in the martial arts community, where people are seeing that flow training is probably a lot more effective. And I'm a big advocate of this, and I heard about this from Coach Faraz Zahabi from the TriStar Gym in Montreal. He's the coach of Georges St. Pierre, which is arguably the best fighter of all time, so he probably knows what he's talking about. And he says that the important part of training is that, one, it's sustainable, two, it's actually fun and engaging, because if it's fun and engaging, you want to come back and do it the next day. If you're having fun and getting fit, then that's way better than dedicating an hour, I've got to do my fitness and all that, and then it sort of becomes a bit of a chore, and it's not really sustainable that way. So whilst me saying I train every day, a lot of that's not conventional training, so it might be that I just start to move, do some monkey movements around the house, or get outside and roll, or go to jiu-jitsu class, or I lift some weights. But this grease the groove principle, the flow state principle, where you're sort of working sub-maximally but often, is like consistency over intensity, and it's actually very, very effective in building strength, and also keeping your body guessing and keeping it fun and keeping it stimulating as well. So I've got a chin-up bar in my house and in my hallway, and I've sort of dedicated periods of time where every time I go past the chin-up bar, I'll just do five chin-ups, or I'll just do 7, sort of working within the 50 RPE to 70 RPE range. My ability to do chin-ups went through the roof, and my strength in the chin-ups went through the roof. I never experienced DOMS, I never experienced fatigue, but like walking every day, you never go, oh, my legs are sore. They just get really strong. But then if you take a hiatus away from walking, your legs would shrink heaps. the same principle applies to other muscles as well. So if I treat a chin-up bar like an everyday movement that I've got to do every day, my body will just adapt naturally, as long as I'm not overtraining and fatiguing myself. That's the grease the groove principle, which was popularized by the Russians, and in particular Pavel Tsatsouline, the kettlebell fella. So yeah, that's how I like to train, constantly in a flow state. And there's actually a chart that accurately describes the flow state. The fella's name is
Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi.
Yeah, we'll go with that. And essentially what it shows is you've got on one side the level of challenge to the person engaging in the exercise, and then down here you've got level of skill. And the flow state essentially is the strip in the middle where it's hard to explain, but it's like, have you ever done an activity and then time just flies by and it's really, you just forget about everything because you're having so much fun? That's where exercise is sort of where you're most optimally working.
So probably on either side of that flow is, stimulation or stimulus and boredom.
Yeah.
It's sort of in between.
Yeah, because you could be overly stimulated, so like anxious.
Yeah.
And then if you're bored, you're not going to come back and do the exercise tomorrow. So it's finding that flow state where it's not too challenging that you hate it, but it's also not too boring that you're not enjoying it.
Yeah.
In the middle, for me, that's Jiu-Jitsu. So a lot of, or shadow boxing or boxing, like for me, I can't do long side cardio. If I get on a treadmill and just run, I'm done.
Boring. Yeah.
But if you make it a game, like shadow boxing or touch sparring, and all of a sudden 20 minutes flies by and you're like, I've just burned 1,000 times more calories.
Yeah.
Not 1,000 times, but a lot more calories than I would on a long side cardio machine, and I'm having fun while doing it. So that kind of style of training is what sort of I do on the daily now, with the exception of a few things where I know I need to do them even though I don't want to, being the accessories and the massage and things like that. Yeah.
Cool.
So the one thing I'll say as well is that there is a graph out there, and I encourage everyone to look it up. It's called the training injury paradox. What it essentially shows is that the more intense your training is, and the more your susceptibility to injury, there's a real relationship between the two. So what you want to do, it looks like an upside down U. Initially, you can train very, very intensely and have very, very low susceptibility to injury. But over time, if you keep training that way, your rate of injury goes up a lot.
Yeah.
So you want to find the sweet spot in the middle, which is moderately intense. And you're going to have some risk, that's just the reality of martial arts, but you want to minimise the risk, so by managing the relationship with training intensity over time. If you overtrain and you train intensely all the time and you don't give yourself an ability to rest or manage it, then your risk of injury goes up through the roof. So that's one thing that we all need to be aware of when we're going back to training.
Yeah. Which I think isn't going to be too far away. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Still a long time away.
But there is things you can do at home in the meantime.
Yeah. All right. So strengthen your body up a bit before you come back to training. Don't just come back in cold. And consider those ideas about load management and injury prevention strategies we can look at. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse.
Cheers.
See you, everybody.